Hello, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. I'm Jane Gillard from Dolby UK. I lead TV partnerships here, working very closely together with Rich Addis, who's going to be from a content services team, who will be leading us through this discussion today. So just to give you a little bit of a plan for the next hour. So Rich has a couple of slides that he's going to take us through. That's going to take about 30 minutes in total. After that, we're going to leave sufficient time for Q&A. So please, during the session, please feel free to use the question box or the chat box to note down any questions you have. I may be able to, to answer a couple of those on the fly as we're moving through the discussion. But if not, as I said, we'll leave plenty of time towards the end of the session where we can answer those in a little bit more detail. So please feel free to use those tools. Okay, so just a really sort of brief introduction to our webinar today. So obviously it's focused on Dolby Atmos, and we here as a UK team have been working across Dolby Atmos within the TV space for about 10 years now. We work across a really broad ecosystem of partners, from content creators and commissioners like BBC and Sky Studios, through to movie and TV services like Sky, Netflix, Apple TV Plus, Disney Plus, and sports broadcasters in the UK like Sky and BT Sports, and of course the huge sort of backbone of TV production companies that support all of those creators and content commissioners. In parallel, as a team, of course, we're working hard with technology partners that make all of this great premium content delivery possible. Like cloud encoding partners like AWS, software tools that enable Q&A. There's a big work effort involved there. And then, of course, in addition to that, out of this team as well, and also Dolby teams globally, of course, we're working away on the huge device ecosystem, making sure that every TV, every soundbar, every iPad, every mobile phone from every manufacturer, given today that those devices are hugely sophisticated from what they can do in terms of sound acoustic design. We work really closely with the OEMs to make sure that we test each and every device, and just to make sure that every device that carries a Dolby logo sounds as good as it possibly can do. As a team, we are very focused at the moment specifically on TV production. This kind of started a couple of years ago, initially with work around premium drama, but increasingly we're working across all other genre of content, from natural history, docs, comedy, light entertainment. Dolby Atmos as a format can support pretty much every genre of content to tell a great story, but we recognize that not every TV production has those sort of high-end TV budgets. So a big focus of Rich's discussion and chat today will be around how you can architect workflows to be as streamlined and as cost effective as possible, so that to enable you to be able to deliver Atmos for shows where budgets are more compromised. Okay, so without further ado, I will hand over to Rich. And as I said, please, during the course of the next half an hour, do use the chat and the question boxes, and we'll answer those at the end. Over to you, Rich.
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rich Addis. I'm a content services engineer here at Dolby. As Jane said, I work across film and TV post-production, helping post-production partners as well as production partners get the best out of Dolby Atmos as a format and get the best use out of it for their particular program. So before we get too deep into it, I think it would be good to get a bit of a straw poll as to who we have on the webinar. We can do a quick poll if you wouldn't mind putting in. Don't worry if you don't want to identify yourself, but if you do, Jane, if you wouldn't mind launching the first poll.
Okay.
Okay, so which option best describes your role? Pick the one most applicable. Okay. About 85%. So give it another couple of seconds. Okay, great. I think we can close it there. So yeah, about 40% sound professionals, 22% producers, 17% directors. So it's a good spread. We've got quite a good foothold in the post-production community already, so it's important to us to get in front of people like yourselves, producers, editors, directors. So that's reassuring that we've got to the right people. So yeah, as Jane said, today we're going to cover off fundamentals of what, how, and why you'd want to deliver Dolby Atmos. So what is Dolby Atmos if you've never come across it before? Why might you want to work in and deliver your content in Dolby Atmos, and how can you go about doing that? So Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos are Dolby's paired offerings in terms of premium sound and vision formats. As Jane said, we've been working with Dolby Atmos in broadcast and home entertainment for about 10 years. And it's widely held to be the premium format and experience, both in cinema and in home entertainment. Really good evidence of quotes, people like Alfonso Cuarón here, who said Dolby Vision, Dolby Atmos sound, the ultimate tools to experience cinema today. And that was him talking about Roma, which, whilst had theatrical release, was a Netflix original, also went straight out onto their streaming platform. Second quick poll, if you wouldn't mind, we'll get into the main slides. Just get a sense of how many people here have already worked in Dolby Atmos. So Jane, if you wouldn't mind toggling the second one. Okay, so it's looking overwhelmingly no so far, which is good. Hopefully you'll all get some good information out of the webinar then. Great. Okay, so every production understandably has decisions to make regarding how you create and deliver your show. Each decision generally evaluated on the benefit that it's going to bring to the production. So the cost, the stress, the difficulty, the complexity, etc. So what are the benefits of Dolby Atmos? So first and foremost, you're getting a high quality, fully immersive 3D audio experience. Secondly, it gives you scalability of your content. So the high quality experience that you've invested time and energy and money into isn't only solely available to those few home theatre enthusiasts who had previously invested in 5.1 hardware at home. In fact, it's accessible to a great number of consumers, already far in excess of the numbers that would have been able to access 5.1 content previously, for example. And thirdly, it gives you all of this through simple, time-efficient workflows, which result in a single master file, allowing you to mix once and deliver to any device which is capable of reproducing that Atmos content. So no longer are you mixing 5.1 just for 5.1 playback, you mix Dolby Atmos for any device which is capable of replaying Dolby Atmos content. So there's quite a few misconceptions that we hear very often about working in Atmos, that it's too expensive, too time consuming, too complicated and too niche. So in the following slides, we'll go through how the Dolby Atmos format and the ecosystem around the format have been designed to maximize the potential benefits to your production whilst also minimizing the cost, minimizing time requirement, complexity, and allowing you to reach a bigger consumer base than the legacy sound formats would have done. So first of all, start at the start. What is Dolby Atmos? So up until now, we've been working within what are referred to as channel-based audio formats, where the end deliverable comprises the same number of audio channels as there are speakers in the reproduction environment. So this is true of mono, stereo, 5.1, 7.1. All of the legacy audio formats were channel-based formats. They were also two-dimensional, which gives your audience a very narrow sound experience. So whilst they were surround, they were only in the horizontal plane. But that isn't how we experience sound in the real world. We hear in 3 dimensions. So for a truly immersive, lifelike experience, we need to be able to create, mix, and deliver audio in a truly 3-dimensional manner. So Dolby Atmos opens you up from the constraints of purely channel-based audio, allowing you to play sounds all around you with pinpoint accuracy, including overhead, to give you a better representation of how we hear and how we absorb sound in the real world. So compared to the flat sound, 2-dimensional sound produced by stereo speakers, as kind of visualized here, Dolby Atmos produces a truly immersive 3-dimensional soundscape. So how does Dolby Atmos achieve this? Well, Dolby Atmos is what's referred to as an object-based audio format. So what we're doing is we're combining traditional channel-based audio beds with dynamic audio objects. Now, the key difference here is that audio objects are not flattened into a channel-based deliverable at the end of the post-production process. If you're familiar with something, well, any editing software where you retain individual channels or tracks or layers, you can think of it as you have a bed as one consolidated layer at the bottom, and then all of your objects remain as individual elements on their own separate layers above that bed. So they're not rendered down into a defined channel-based format at the end of post. They remain as individual objects all the way through post-production, then all the way through the broadcast chain and distribution, all the way down to the end user. So when you're working with audio objects in a post-production environment, you have to define those as objects, and then you have to define where those objects are going to exist in space. So as visualized here, you can give an object an X, Y, Z coordinate, which exists as metadata, and that metadata will be passed through the entire distribution chain all the way down to the end user. So in addition to positional metadata, there are also some other metadata controls that you can use. So another option is you can increase the size of an audio object. So rather than being something which is a pinpoint source within your soundscape, for example, in a forest scene, you might want the overhead canopy of the rainforest to fill the entire room. But if you wanted to pan the sound of an individual insect or a bird around that space, you can do that using an object with the size metadata turned down or up, depending on what you want to achieve. So that's in principle what an object-based audio format is. So covered off that. So why should you create your project in Dolby Atmos? So what are the benefits of an object-based system? So expanding on some of the points we've already touched upon, there are various limitations of channel-based formats. So first of all, they have a limited market share. There's very few 5.1 systems out in the marketplace compared to stereo, which was distributed on every TV out there. The next step up from stereo was 5.1, which required dedicated deliverables to be created. which had to be played back on their dedicated hardware, precisely configured solely for 5.1 playback. So when your premium deliverable only works on one speaker configuration, that's not really practical or cost effective for either the production or the consumer. And lastly, you have limited surround accuracy, as you can only pan a sound to an individual speaker position rather to a specific point in XYZ space. So if the end user hasn't configured their setup correctly, they're not going to get a perfect reproduction. And also, it's this XYZ metadata not being rendered until the very end of the process, which allows the format to scale to every device, whether it has 2 speakers, 4 speakers, 10, 12, 16, 24 speakers. It will scale to any device. So Dolby Atmos solves all of the problems of the legacy channel-based formats. So compared to the limited market share, there are already many devices, Dolby Atmos capable devices in consumers' homes and even in their pockets, ranging from mobile phones, soundbars, TVs, tablets, all the way up to full home theaters. And considering the variety of the devices that there are out in the marketplace, again, there's no need for a dedicated deliverable for each and every device configuration. One deliverable will work across all devices regardless of the speaker layout. Your premium deliverable no longer solely applicable to that niche home theater audience. In terms of the limited surround accuracy, as I've said, by using metadata, Dolby Atmos devices are able to translate that positional information highly accurately to any device, producing a full, truly immersive 3D sound experience. So why is this important? Well, we're no longer watching TV only on TVs. As I say, laptops, tablets, soundbars, TVs with inbuilt side and up-firing speakers, mobile devices, headphones, full home theater installations. There's a huge number of devices out in the marketplace. To get a bit of a sense of this, again, let's do another little straw poll here. Jane, if you wouldn't mind putting up the third poll. Okay, so worldwide, how many Dolby Atmos devices are currently in the marketplace? How many do you think are out there currently? So more than 100,000, more than 1 million, or more than 1 billion? Okay, we're about 75%. Okay, so most people plumbed for more than 1 million. In fact, there's over 1 billion Dolby Atmos enabled devices already in the marketplace, ranging from mobile phones all the way up to full home theater systems. So you can see that already, in comparison to 5.1 systems, for example, there's a huge number more systems out there in the marketplace that can already, as of today, consume Dolby Atmos content and give people a better than stereo or better than 5.1 experience. And this slide, again, just recaps the range of consumer devices that are out there in the marketplace. And again, it's the metadata which is the key to the scalability of the format. So whether the device has 2 speakers or 24 speakers, it will scale appropriately to that device. Okay, so how does creating a Dolby Atmos mix fit into your existing workflows? Is it difficult? In fact, it isn't the case at all. From a production standpoint, there is negligible impact at the production stage. Working in Dolby Atmos is primarily a post-production concern. We've got Dolby Atmos mixing tools already integrated into all the industry standard DAW softwares. And a large proportion of the post-production facilities across London and across the UK are already Atmos enabled and have been working in the format for a number of years. So with the support of Dolby, as well as the support of your existing post-production partners, there's a huge amount of talent and experience already there in the industry to help you guide you through the initial kind of learning curves when you do hit post-production. But focusing still on production, you would capture sound exactly the same manner that you would for working in 5.1 or in stereo. So the primary goal, capturing clean, clear, well-isolated sounds that can be then layered up during post-production. So working in Dolby Atmos is absolutely no different. Rather than building a physical world that you would capture in your camera, for example, what you're doing with your soundtrack, whether it be stereo, 5.1 or Atmos, so what you're doing is you're assembling your kit of parts to do the world building part of the process in post-production. Having the isolated recordings gives you that flexibility to manipulate things as you desire once you get to the post-production. You might want to consider what opportunities working in 3D audio will afford you whilst you're in your pre-production and planning stage. For example, if you know that you're going to be going to a fantastic immersive environment, we've had examples of natural history programming where they've gone out to bat caves, for example. The reverberation and the sound within those environments is incredible. So do you have the right microphone, or do you have the right recording equipment to be able to best capture that, to then be able to reproduce that in a Dolby Atmos environment? So again, there's a huge amount of talent and experience already in the post-production community. So we'd advise you to get in touch with your post-production studio as early as possible, if you know who they are going to be at the shoot stage, to discuss with them what they might want from you in terms of additional considerations of additional wild tracks that they might find useful. Other than that, very little production impact. So once you reach post-production, the process again is very straightforward and not too dissimilar to working in 5.1. All of the industry standard DAWs such as Pro Tools, Nuendo, Fairlight within DaVinci Resolve all have integrated Dolby Atmos tool sets, meaning there's a very shallow learning curve for sound editors and mixers to go through, even if they've never worked in Atmos before, because they're using familiar tools, familiar panners. All of the plugins many of the plugins rather are able to work with Dolby Atmos channel counts as well. So all fully integrated. As you can see from this diagram, this shows the kind of the signal flow through a post-production signal chain. You probably don't need to understand fully exactly what's going on here, but it's good to highlight and point out the block in the middle, which is the Dolby Atmos renderer. So this is the main difference between working in 5.1, where you would just output straight to a set of loudspeakers. With Dolby Atmos, if you remember, we were talking about the fact that it scales to any type of speaker set in the consumer environment. That is also applicable in post. So you output audio from Pro Tools or Nuendo, or whichever DAW your team is using. That audio is passed to the Dolby Atmos renderer, and that Dolby Atmos renderer is set up by the post facility to understand precisely what speaker configuration is on the back of it. The great thing about the scalability of the format is that you don't even need to have a speaker set on the back of the renderer. You can literally just have a set of headphones plugged in, which means that from a workflow perspective, your sound editorial team can start working in Dolby Atmos from day one of sound editorial. And all of the work and all of the information that they're putting into that session, all the pan metadata, object assignments, bed assignments, all of that will pass all the way through the process from day one of editorial up to the final day of the final mix. So in terms of streamlined workflow, Dolby Atmos is incredibly efficient, meaning that you can minimize the amount of time and conforming sessions and importing things into different templates as the process goes on. And lastly, you can see in the bottom right corner here, the Dolby Atmos renderer facilitates the creation of the master deliverable files. This can consist of something called a .atmos file, which is a package of files, effectively. Or more commonly now, you'll be delivering an ADM BWAV file, depending on the broadcaster or the streaming partner that you're working with. check their delivery specification of what they accept, but primarily you're looking at the .atmos package or an ADM BWAV as your master deliverable. All you really need to know about those is that it contains all of the audio as well as all of the associated metadata that's generated in the post-production environment. The last point here is, and I think the reality is that at the moment, Dolby Atmos is inevitably going to coexist with the legacy channel-based deliverables. So stereo and 5.1 are still required by all major distributors and streamers and broadcasters to be delivered alongside the Dolby Atmos file. We fully appreciate that that's the reality of things. So we've designed a tool set in a manner which facilitates the easy generation of those deliverables directly from the Dolby Atmos master file. So rather than having to necessarily do the Dolby Atmos mix and then spend additional days doing a 5.1 version and then additional days beyond that to do a stereo version, you can, if you so desire, tick a button and the Dolby Atmos production tools will generate your 5.1 and your stereo deliverables automatically from the Dolby Atmos master file. You may or may not want to do that as a completely black box system where you don't know exactly what's going on under the hood. So we've integrated additional trim tools. If you're familiar with Dolby Vision, works in a very similar way that you can trim the Atmos version of how that folds down into stereo and into 5.1 so that you can retain some creative control over what those legacy formats deliverables are going to sound like off the back of it. So again, very straightforward. We've tried to make it as streamlined and as effective and as efficient as possible to make it simple and make the process as painless as possible. So what does Dolby Atmos offer you creatively? Aside from the production concerns and the post-production concerns, creatively, what is the format going to bring to your show, to your film? It's easy to think about Dolby Atmos as a tool for very effects-heavy shows, big bombastic explosions, things like that. But I think the number one term to take away from you with all of this is immersion. So as we described, Dolby Atmos gives you the extra third dimension of audio, which helps to envelop the audience into the scene. And actually, some of the most effective use cases that we've seen and heard have been some of the simplest. You wouldn't necessarily expect stand-up comedy to have much to offer in Dolby Atmos, for example, but giving your viewers the feeling that they're there in the audience in the middle of the crowd, in fact, works brilliantly. Same with music and concert films, building out the scene to mirror the acoustic environment that's being reproduced on screen, putting you in that huge concert hall in the middle of the Royal Albert Hall, something like that, or in a grimy little kind of pub bar. It works incredibly effectively. Room tone is often probably the most boring part of many soundtracks, but effective use of room tone and subtle ambiences and almost silence can be incredibly effective at immersing the audience and putting people inside a scene. A great example of immersion is some great examples at the bottom of the slides across a few factual genres, but a great example, F1 Drive to Survive. The sound team did a lot of work trying to place the viewer inside the racing cars. So the cockpit radio communications are in the center of the sound fields. Sounds like it's coming from inside your head almost, as though you're wearing the headset yourself, and built up all of the car sounds and the race sounds accurately placed around you to try and represent truly how it feels to be in the cockpit of that car. There's a lot of enthusiasm we're hearing from the natural history world. I suppose that the main MO of making a natural history film is to present a realistic view of the world. So being able to wrap the audience up in an accurately represented version of a location somewhere in the world, it's gonna only benefit the show to give that added additional layer of realism to the program. And then the last point I have on this slide is it's a really effective tool to add add money to shots. We spoke with Bonnie Wild, who re-recording mixer at Skywalker, who worked on The Mandalorian in Dolby Atmos, and she described it as this is a fantastic tool to add money to a shot. So rather than extending an expensive VFX shot, you can tell the story using off-screen sound much more effectively than you could in stereo or in 5.1. So she describes a couple of scenes where the spaceship flies in from the back corner of the room overhead, and then you only see the spaceship far in the distance for the last quarter of the shot actually. But using Dolby Atmos and being able to pan things around the space and use the overhead channels effectively means that you can still tell a very effective story without having to spend all the money on the VFX budget. So to give a quick recap, the main delivery benefits here are the ability to master once and optimize that soundtrack for every device, fully integrated in industry standard tools and software. And we have the ability to create all of your standard deliverables, 7.1, 5.1 and stereo down mixes directly from your Atmos master, streamlining the whole process. Additionally, you have that advanced metadata to be able to fine-tune the mix for 5.1 stereo and headphone playback as well. Dolby Atmos is incredibly effective in headphone playback as well, which you can consume on Apple devices through Netflix, for example. You can consume Atmos over headphones directly as well. So in summary, it gives you cost-saving, time-effective workflows, future-proof deliverables, single master asset file, which is applicable to every device out there in the marketplace. You're able to deliver fully realized artistic intent and quality across all enabled consumer devices. You're maximizing the audience reach, and it's giving you additional tools to play with in the post-production environment to expand the creative palette for your film. So that is a quick half-hour summary of Dolby Atmos and how it might hopefully fit into your production. So with that, we're going to turn it over to the Q&A. So Jane, if we have any questions that have come in so far, then we can cover those off. Or if anyone has any questions they want to ask, then yeah, put them in the chat now.
Brilliant. Okay, great. So whilst those questions are coming in, so we've just got a first one here, Rich, which is from Martin. Can you outline the difference between Dolby Atmos and Dolby Vision?
Sure. So Dolby Atmos is our immersive sound offering. Dolby Vision is our HDR offering. So main difference is vision versus sound. Dolby Vision works by giving you the additional dynamic range that you can't work with in standard dynamic range. In addition to, again, it's a dynamic metadata control technology. So rather than using something like HDR10, where the program as a whole has to be set have its peak brightness level set across the entirety of the program, with Dolby Vision, it allows you to set the metadata on an individual shot-by-shot basis. So without going too deep into that, given it's an Atmos webinar, I think I'll probably wrap it at that. Also, Atmos is my speciality. So if you've got any other questions about Vision, then send us an email and we can put you in touch with the Vision team.
Awesome, thanks, Rich. Yeah, the questions are coming in thick and fast now. So just a next question from James, who's a screenwriter. Maybe I'll take this one actually. So he has a project and a story which would be highly suited for Atmos delivery, and he's asking who's looking at this content at development stage. Is it something that's in the headline of the pitch? So what I'd say there, James, is that, as I kind of briefly said in the intro, so we're working across, you know, a huge range of sort of streaming services and pay TV partners, specifically in the UK, who are using Atmos in their production. So that could be people like Apple TV Plus, Sky, Netflix. So I'd say all of those companies, as a starting point, are really focused on delivering just now a premium audio experience with Dolby Atmos. So that would be a great starting point. Cool. Okay. So next one from Neo. How's the compatibility with competitor products like MPEG-H, both in terms of creation as well as rendering at the consumer end?
So I wouldn't say MPEG-H is necessarily a competitive format. It's a framework within which content is going to be able to be delivered. So I'm not really sure what we can what specifically I can answer in relation to that. In terms of creation DAW files as well as rendering at consumer end. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure on the gist of the question, I'm afraid. If you want to ask the question again, then maybe we can come back to it at the end. But yeah, let's move on to the next one.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Rich. Next question. I'm guessing that this adds to the sound costs in post. Can you give any indication, Rich, of what that additional cost is likely to be?
Sure. So without sounding too much of a cop-out answer, it's entirely contextual. I think certain programming will obviously warrant a huge amount of time and money to be spent on sound design and sound editorial, for example. So I think within the budget, the point in the process for something that you know is going to be a very effects-heavy concern, I think the sound editorial team would probably be the ones who would be most appreciative of that additional time and budget, because you're physically having to put more sound into the session that the dubbing mixer can then pan around and fill out the 3D space. If you're working with something which is I mean, the example I used earlier, something like stand-up comedy, where the use of the Atmos format is going to be relatively static. It's going to be to do with panning and positioning sound and ambiances and setting reverbs to give you that sense that you are immersed in that space, but you're in that space for the duration. So something like that I would expect to take less time than something which is a very effects-heavy concern. It's very difficult to put an exact number on a percentage or budget wise, but I think if you take a comparison of what the uplift would be between stereo and 5.1, I wouldn't expect to see a comparable uplift going from 5.1 to Atmos. What you've budgeted for previously for a 5.1 show, I'd probably add a cursory, I don't know, between 25 and 50% would cover the vast majority of Atmos mixes. But again, totally content dependent. So the best person to talk to is your post-production partner.
Brilliant, thanks, Rich. Next question from Eli. Can you give a bit more information, Rich, about how it's possible to mix Atmos using headphones?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Dolby Atmos tools, there's a bit of software called the Dolby Atmos Production Suite, which runs as a sidecar bit of software to Pro Tools or whichever DAW you're using. You can take a headphone output directly from that. Now that can either be one of two formats. It's either going to be straight stereo fold down, or it could be taking the binaural output. So again, without going into too much detail, the binaural output gives you a rendered representation of the full 3D soundscape. So the way that binaural works is that it renders it through a system which approximates the real world cues that your brain and your ears and your auditory system uses to identify and localize sound in space. So for example, if someone's talking off on your left hand side, that sound will arrive at your left and right ear at different times, different levels, and then there'll also be a frequency difference between the sound as it's recorded or picked up. If you had microphones in your ears, they would hear slightly different things. So that's how we localize sound in the real world. So the binaural render uses an approximation of that system to be able to render the fully immersive 3D Atmos mix out to a binaural system, which when you listen on headphones, and only on headphones will this work, you will get a sense of things being above, in front, behind you, so that you can effectively work in Atmos from day one, even though that you don't have a speaker set connected.
Brilliant, thank you, Rich. And now slightly related, but more on the playback side. So having chosen, and this is a question from David, having chosen XYZ coordinates for a sound objects, how will listeners in different places in an auditorium, for example, experience this sound differently?
Okay, so the real benefit of using an XYZ coordinate is that it can be placed to an individual point in space. So obviously, if you're sat somewhere slightly differently in the auditorium, you're going to experience that as coming from a slightly different place. If something's panned to the middle of the room and you're on the left of the room, you should experience that being to your right. Conversely, if you're sat on the right side and it's panned to the middle, then you would experience that being on the left. That gives you a huge amount of kind of fine granular control to place things very accurately within that 3D space. I think it's probably good to identify the difference between theatrical Atmos at this point and home entertainment Atmos. So theatrical Atmos, they both work in exactly the same manner, but there's a few different delivery concerns. But in a theatrical environment where you're working with a huge space to pan things around in versus a home entertainment scenario, you're probably going to experience those differences slightly less in a home entertainment environment because you're physically in a smaller space. What else could I add on that point? How will listeners experience this differently? I suppose the other thing to mention then is if you compare 5.1 audio, which would have been replayed in a cinema environment, if you go to any standard multiplex and look at the number of speakers that exist on the side walls and the rear wall, in a 5.1 system, every single one of those speakers on the left-hand side at the rear and all the speakers on the right-hand side and the rear only ever reproduce one channel. So they're all playing exactly the same thing. By using XYZ coordinates, it allows you to pan the sound through any one of those individual loudspeakers to give you that pinpoint panning accuracy within the space. That's probably a lot more appreciable in a cinema environment where you have that number of speakers, but the same is still applicable. Exactly the same technology, and it's the metadata that allows this to work. The same thing is applicable in a home entertainment environment, and that's why it works from anything from sound bars all the way up to sort of 20 plus loudspeaker home theatre systems. Hopefully that covers off that question.
Yeah, that was a lot of detail. Thanks, Rich. So our next question from Stan, I can probably take this one. So how would you suggest a sound student could get experience working in Atmos? So Stan, the good news here is that we've made a huge amount of effort during the last couple of years to make a lot of resources available, sort of freely available online. So we have a great sort of library of resources on a site called dolbyprofessional.com, and that tells you everything from, you know, what you need to mix, how to configure a studio, how to prepare deliverables. So that could be potentially a good port of call. We also have what's called the Dolby Institute, so that's also another online resource. And within Dolby Institute, we have a huge amount of interviews with sort of leading sound producers, sound mixers, and also sort of training interviews within Dolby Institute as well. So they're immediately sort of two things that you could potentially check out. Okay, next question from Jarek. Speaking of limited surround accuracy in channel-based systems, isn't Atmos possibly also inaccurate, as even more speakers are to be installed? Studios are surely professionally calibrated, but how about home setups?
Sure. So I think the first point is one that I kind of covered talking about cinema, where what I was talking about previously in terms of limited surround accuracy, I'm talking about your ability to resolve a sound's position in space. So accuracy in terms of locational accuracy as opposed to the accuracy of the reproduction. Studios are indeed professionally calibrated. Home setups have become a far more advanced concern in terms of being able to calibrate themselves. So obviously there's a range within the marketplace, but the upper ends of the range, those AVRs and soundbars often come with calibration microphones. The Sonos system, for example, calibrates itself via an app which you can run on your smartphone. So there's a lot more options out there in the consumer marketplace that allow you to calibrate your system rather than just taking it straight out of the box, sitting it on your TV stands and away you go. Obviously, you're totally right. There's a degree of calibration that's required that is going to give you the best reproduction in your home environment. But this is the great thing about the Dolby Atmos ecosystem, is that a large amount of that information can be pre-programmed into the device, and in fact has to be pre-programmed into the device by the manufacturer, so that the Atmos system knows how to decode in the most appropriate manner for the capabilities of that device.
Brilliant, thanks Rich. So now a question from Neo regarding VR. So how might you go about mixing a Dolby Atmos track within a VR environment? And can you explain a little bit how head tracking is incorporated into Atmos workflow design?
Okay, so we used to have some VR tools within the Dolby Atmos tool set, which were used for 360 video post-production work. But as we found, there was limited use of those tools, and there were other tools on the marketplace which did a very good job at satisfying that need. So we've actually removed the VR tools from the production suite environment. In terms of head tracking, there are certain scenarios where you can reproduce an Atmos mix in a head tracked environment. So the most obvious one would be if you export an MP4 from the production suite and airdrop it across to an iOS device, an iPhone, for example, you can play that back in Atmos natively from the files folder. And if you have head tracking enabled on the Apple device, then you can experience the Atmos mix played back in a head tracked environment. So in terms of incorporating into the workflow, I think that's how you would go about monitoring something in a head tracked environment.
Brilliant, thanks Rich. And now a couple of questions with regards to audio objects. So first of all, you mentioned, Rich, a limit of 118 audio objects from an earlier slide. Yeah, can you just give a bit more information about that, and if that's across the entire movie or TV show?
Yeah, sure. So this slide was, in fact, I might be able to go back to it so it's in front of us now. So this slide covers the, yeah, here we go. This slide shows the post-production setup. So the total channel count is 128. So you have a 712 bed, which takes up 10, and then you have 118 up to 118 audio objects. The reason for that is primarily just down to the number of channels that we can easily pass from one device to another. But no, it's not over the entire film. It's concurrent. So you can think of it exactly the same as you think of an Avid timeline or a Pro Tools timeline. You have 118 layers or audio channels that can play back concurrently. To be perfectly honest, I have seen very, very few programs, even feature films up to the kind of big effects-heavy Marvel type tentpole features, that use all 118 objects concurrently. Very often, the object use is far lower than that, because you're not necessarily having to have them all used simultaneously. So what people will very often do is group them out. So maybe you'll have 20 dedicated for sound effects, 20 dedicated for dialogue, 20 dedicated for music, so that within your mix template, there's a degree of separation there that means that everything's easy to find and navigate your way through. So yeah, no, it's not 118 total. Once you've used 118, that's it. As long as they don't overlap, then yeah, you've got absolutely loads of flexibility there.
Brilliant, thanks, Rich. So a follow-up question with regards to audio objects. Are there any plans to introduce audio objects that can be experienced below the eye line?
That is, yeah. So to give some context to this, when you're in the panning environment, again, let me go back to the slide that shows that. It assumes that you are in an auditorium type environment. So the assumption is that you're seated on the floor level, and then the side surrounds are immediately next to you, and then obviously overheads are overhead. So I think the question is audio objects below the eye line. So the limitation is always going to be, do you have a speaker in that position which can reproduce that? So the difficulty that you're going to find here is, and in fact, I think there was the functionality within the VR tools to do this, because you could obviously look down, but in a reproduced environment, you're very, very unlikely to have floor-based loudspeakers to reproduce content. So I can't answer definitively, but my expectation would be no. I wouldn't expect that we're going to be able to introduce that, given the current tools that we have available.
Great, thanks, Rich. Now a question from Ian with regards to studios. So are there any plans to approve Atmos configurations for studios that do not have enough height to fly sub-bass?
Okay, so I'm going to answer based on what I think the question is asking. So in a theatrical Atmos environment, and indeed in some home entertainment systems, you can install a bass managed loudspeaker system. The reason that you might want to do that is that Atmos as a format assumes that you have full range capability in any speaker position. So whereas historically in the cinema you would have big meaty screen channel loudspeakers, you pan something off the screen and you'd lose a lot of the low end bass content. So what we do in a theatrical environment is we would expect there to be rear bass management subs which are installed high in the room, at the rear of the room, so that as you pan something off the screen channels into the room, they are there and available to reproduce that low end content, so you get the effect of it being full frequency range anywhere within the room. In the home entertainment system, you're generally working in smaller environments. Low frequency content is primarily assumed to be omnidirectional. Obviously, when you're in a cinema size room, whilst it's omnidirectional, you're still probably going to tell that it's coming from the front of the room. But in a smaller post-production environment for home entertainment, the directionality of the low-end content isn't as easily discernible as to where it's coming from. So what we generally do in smaller post-production studios is we might base manage to the main LFE subwoofer, which is part of the screen, so that as you pan something off the screen into the surround channels, the low end content, although it's being reproduced at the front of the room, you're not going to notice the difference in location of where that's coming from. You'll still feel that the sound still has weight and heft. So in terms of going back to the actual question, are there plans to approve Atmos configurations for studios that don't have enough heights to fly the sub bass? Then we absolutely do work with people who have height restrictions. I think the reality of London architecture means that there are a lot of studios out there which are space limited. So if you have a specific case where you need to get a solution that works for your studio or your particular architectural limitations, then get in touch with us here at Dolby, and we can help you and work with you to try and get the best solution possible.
Great, thanks, Rich. And thank you from Ian. Another question from Neo. Oh, this is about what method is your binaural rendering based on, but I kind of feel that you may have answered that previously when we talked about mixing Atmos over headphones, unless there's anything, Rich, you want to add more to that?
There's, yeah, I mean, I can't go into too much detail as to exactly what's going on under the hood. It's a proprietary Dolby algorithm that we use. The one thing that we haven't mentioned is if you are working in a binaural environment, and this may be less applicable to post-production, but it is highly applicable to Atmos Music, which many of you may have seen has recently launched. The Dolby system for binaural does give you additional flexibility on just a kind of bake it out and that's it done kind of system that people would usually be used to working with binaural in. So we have technology within the production suite of Atmos tools which allows you to set on an object by object basis a different rendering mode. So you can either set an object to be near, mid distance or far distance, and the process which is used to render that object will differ depending on which setting you've given it. So I think normal binaural systems where they are just rendering the full mix, effectively what they're doing is a speaker virtualization. So it feels like you're sat in the middle of a 714 set of loudspeakers. But with the Dolby Atmos tools, it allows you to push sound away from you. So instead of just being a set of loudspeakers that you're sat in the middle of, you can have something sounding though it's right in front of you, and you can place things further away in the soundscape. And you can do that with the settings. I mean, in a post-production environment, your sound editorial team and your dubbing mixer would spend a long time playing with reverb settings and EQ to create that depth within effectively what is a flat environment. But with the Dolby Atmos binaural tools, you have an additional tool at your disposal which will help you build that depth into your soundtrack.
Brilliant, thanks, Rich. Okay, so we're at time now, I think. So there are a couple of questions about effectively format interchange. So, you know, creating in Dolby Atmos, but potentially interchanging into other immersive formats like MPEG-H and 360 and Sony 360. So that's probably not a quick one to answer. So Ian, Neo, thanks for those questions. I guess what I'd say there is that we'll come back to you offline and answer those in a bit more detail. And to everybody else, so thanks ever so much for your time today. So this recording, this webinar today can be made available to you through the GoToWebinar platform. So that will be made available shortly. Also, our colleague Miriam has made a couple of different handouts available. There's a case study there about a show that we've partnered around, and some information about, you know, more in depth around the Dolby Atmos ecosystem. And as I mentioned previously to Stan, in terms of, you know, more resources, and training. We also have a lot of resources online at dolbyprofessional.com and also at the Dolby Institute. So, but of course, you know, we are, as I mentioned very much at the beginning, we're here as a team to help support the TV production community. So if you have additional questions, then please do come back to us, and we can engage with you directly, no problem at all. So thank you. Anything, Rich, before we close from your side?
No, not at all. Just to say and reiterate that if anyone has any further questions that they want to ask, we can absolutely take this offline. And yeah, thank you all for tuning in.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, all.